try this again, Derek. Here we go. Right. Yeah, there we go.
All right, let's get the appropriate backdrop here. There we go.
Ah, perfect, perfect. There we go.
All right.
So let's dive straight in. If we so that just on the theory that this could happen again, just in case.
This
So
is
I
one of
just
the
got
issues we run into with internet out here in rural America. We are not only have slow internet because we're not close to a city, but we have to uh, we've got a what they call a mesh network that connects the building I'm sitting in, which was a metal shop building or a pole barn on our
mhm.
property. So I've got like two hops connecting this to the router back in our kitchen, which is a good I don't know 150 feet and through several walls.
Yeah.
From where I'm sitting right now, so every now and again I have to go and just unplug the mesh network connector and reset. So it was fine until you actually prayed against it.
I know.
But if
That's
this is
just
the
the way it
worst the
is.
enemy can do, then we're doing all right.
Yeah. Um, so I have to fill the gap. I gave a bio of yourself. Talked about your books. I gave a list of your books and 5 and 10 and View from the Bunker, which I watch avidly. You're someone that we have
Thank you.
wanted on, um, just simply because like this is. I kind of feel like a kid in a sweet shop at the minute because I have been graced in the sense that I'm just messaging people that I really admire, and every one of them has been lovely and went, yes, of course we'll come on, and that's the way the kingdom should be, and it's just fantastic because
Absolutely.
what I really want to do is to open people's eyes to theology that is biblical, that is straight out of the Bible, but that people often miss because a lot of people just, glance over things. And I was a big fan of Dr. Michael Heiser,
Yes, yes.
and I read, I think it was Unseen Realm. Is it Supernatural? I've forgotten the names of it.
Supernatural,
Yes,
reversing Herman, and of course there's
yes.
Reader's Companion to the Book of Enoch, which has been very eye opening as well.
And the whole the expounding or the exegesis that he brings in, especially around the term Elohim and the council that would be the council of the B'nai Elohim, the council of small g gods.
Hmm.
I think that gets lost a lot. Like a lot of people will glance over Genesis 6, and I was sharing just I'm going to ask a question off the back of this and let you take the rein, but how he proposed basically the fall is not, we quantify if you ask a question, what's the problem with the world, and everybody goes the fall, specifically if you're Christian, but the fall in Genesis 3 was then followed up with Genesis 6, which then culminated in the rebellion of Genesis 11. And we know that there's been, the 70 is the term of the nations. I know there's more than 70 nations, but this is the rule according to Deuteronomy 32:8 that these B'nai Elohim would have been spiritual principalities and powers over those territories to a certain degree. And in that, how do you see this in terms of? I know you're the book that you've written, the Second Coming of Saturn. How do you see this in terms of nowadays, as in, are people, is the church blind to the spiritual battle that we're in, as in the spiritual warfare?
Yeah,
And maybe you can elaborate on some of the things that we miss. If I just let you take the rein.
sure. Yeah, as Mike used to say, if it's in the Bible and it's weird, it's probably important, and that's kind of the motto by which Sharon and I have lived the last 7, 8 years since we came to the Ozarks here. This is Southwest Missouri. We're actually closer to Tulsa, Oklahoma, than we are to any place, any major city in Missouri. Springfield is the closest town here, and we've been working with and alongside Skywatch TV, a media ministry here based in the Ozarks since 2015. But with that came the opportunity to spend our days and evenings researching and writing. I mean, we're blessed that our daughter is happy, healthy, living on our own, and so we don't have the responsibilities of child rearing at this point. Not that we regret a moment of that. It just gives us free time that parents with children in the home don't have. So we've been able to devote our time to that kind of study. And really, all we've done, Gary, is take Mike's teachings and try to apply these to Scripture. You were very correct in saying that Mike pointed out that we Christians, those of us who take the Bible seriously, will point to Genesis chapter 3 and the fall in the garden as the reason the world is in the state that it's in, but that Jews of the Second Temple period, and that's the period between the return of the Jews from Babylon to Jerusalem to set up the kingdom of Judah again, which was only independent for a short time during the time of the Maccabees. But from the rebuilding of the temple around 440 BC until the Romans destroyed it in 70 AD, that's the Second Temple period. So if you ask a Jew during that Genesis 3, the rebellion of Adam and Eve, the disobedience of Adam and Eve. Genesis chapter 6, where the sons of God, named in Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4, came down, saw that the daughters of men were fair, and took wives of any they chose. And from them came the giants, the Nephilim, who were in the earth in those days and also after that. But then, of course, Genesis 11, where they tried to essentially build I hate to use the word portal because it's kind of charged, but that's essentially what they were trying to do with Babel. Babel was not a tower that was intended to reach to heaven. I would suggest to you that even 5,000 years ago, engineers were smart enough to realize that you could not stack mud brick high enough to literally reach into heaven. But what they were trying to do was build a place, a cult center that allowed them to reconnect with the gods who used to walk the earth. And these were probably those spirits that we call the sons of God, or the watchers mentioned in the book of First Enoch, the 200 or so who descended on Mount Hermon and were punished for their transgression by being banished to the bottomless pit, the abyss. We know this from Peter and Jude. So you got those three rebellions, and then, of course, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview that you alluded to, where Moses, in retelling the history of the Israelites, reminded them that when God gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided the nations, he numbered them according to the number of the sons of God. And that number, when you go to Genesis chapter 10, which is the table of nations, the descendants of Noah that are listed, there are 70 named there. Now, does this mean that there were 70 angelic beings or sons of God who were then allowed to supervise humanity? Not exactly, because there are more than 70 nations or 70 ethnicities out there in the ancient Near East. Not just with the Israelites, but all across the ancient Near East, the number 70 was symbolic. It represented all of them. If you were to draw a Venn diagram and put the number 70 in it, it would basically include everything. So the point was that, because we see that number show up a couple of times in the Bible, where, for example, the 70 sons of Ahab were killed in a rebellion. The 70 sons of Gideon, except for one who got away, were killed. Did it mean that they literally had 70 flesh and blood descendants? No, the point of the story was that all of them, everyone, the complete set, not one left out, was wiped out. So the point of Deuteronomy 32, and this is supported by Deuteronomy 4, verses 19 and 20, that God allotted to the nations as their gods, small g gods, these supernatural entities that we might call angels. That's not a precise enough term, but the nations were under the supervision of these supernatural entities, these B'nai Ha-Elohim, sons of God, and except for the one nation that God reserved for himself, which was Israel. Israel is God's allotted portion, his inheritance. That Deuteronomy 4, 19 and 20, Moses is told by God, tell the Israelites when they look up not to worship the sun and the moon and all the host of heaven, the heavenly army, things that I've allotted to the nations for their inheritance. So, and when you read carefully the writings of the early church fathers and Second Temple Jewish literature, it's clear that it was understood that these angels, for lack of a better term, were given or assigned the responsibility and the authority to administer things on earth. But they chose to accept worship for themselves instead of directing humanity's worship toward their creator, the one who created them, spoke the whole universe into existence. We see this in Psalm 82, where it's like a courtroom scene in heaven. And Mike used to tell the story about how, as a divinity school student, one of his friends came to him and said, "Have you read Psalm 82?" And I mean, really read Psalm 82? And when you read that, it seems odd. This is something I don't remember ever hearing in a church setting. I never heard a pastor preach on it. Psalm 82 reads, verse 1, God has taken his place in the divine council. That was a term that you alluded to earlier. In the midst of the gods, plural, he holds judgment. So wait a minute. We thought there was only one God, capital. Well, yes, there is only one capital G God, only one capital E, Elohim. That's Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the creator of all things. God the Father, from a Trinitarian Christian perspective. But there are many small g gods. There are many small e Elohim. That is a term that simply means a denizen of, to borrow the title of Mike's book, the unseen realm. In fact, even the spirit of Samuel, when he returns in the incident with King Saul and the witch of Endor, the medium of Endor, the spirit of Samuel, the prophet, is referred to as an Elohim. So we need, as English speakers, we need to get past our hang-up over that three-letter word G-O-D, because it does refer to more, in the lowercase g, it refers to more entities than just Yahweh, the creator of all things. And when you read Psalm 82, it's clear that God is decreeing a sentence on these entities. Verse 6, I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince, end quote. So God has decreed a sentence of death on these rebellious fallen angels. Sentence has been decreed. It has yet to be carried out. So in a nutshell, that is why the world is in such a state. The fall in the garden, yes. Yeah. The sons of God who rebelled not only tried to corrupt humanity's bloodline through physical interaction, commingling, but also taught us things we weren't supposed to know. And through this commingling and the creation of the giants, it was understood by the Jews of the Second Temple period and the early church fathers that that was the origin of demons. The spirits of these giants who died in the flood of Noah were condemned to continue wandering the earth, afflicting humanity until the judgment. So these sons of God, when they rebelled, created a sort of supernatural army, demons, taught us things we weren't supposed to know, and inspired these cults that have venerated the dead for millennia that continue down to this day. I mean, that was the point of our book, Veneration. Where do demons come from? How do they afflict the world today? We can see all over the world, from cultures as diverse as sub-Saharan Africa and the Far East, Vietnam, Korea, China. The veneration of ancestors continues to this day, but it's not really the ancestors, it's the spirits of these entities destroyed in the flood thousands of years ago. So that's why we are where we are. This is a supernatural war, and yes, as you said, the church is by and large blind to what's happening. There's a pollster here in the United States by the name of George Barna, who is now affiliated with Arizona Christian University, and every year he conducts a survey of Americans to sort of take the theological temperature of the country, if you will. He, in his worldview study, year after year, his worldview survey, has defined what he calls the biblical worldview as somebody who holds 6 basic tenets or precepts of Christianity. I mean, Christianity 101, things like Jesus, people who agree with the following statements. Jesus was born of a virgin. Jesus lived a sinless life. You cannot earn your way into heaven. Satan is a literal entity and not just a concept or an idea. And the people who hold to those 6 basic precepts are defined as having a biblical worldview. Well, as of the year 2020, the percentage of Americans, and we, the church in America, like to perhaps boastfully pride ourselves on being the most Christian nation on earth, but only 6% of Americans have a biblical worldview. And at that time, only 19% who described themselves as evangelical Christians had a biblical worldview. Well, since 2020 and the lockdowns that followed, where our churches were shuttered for a couple of years, that percentage has now dropped from 6% to 4%. Only 4% of Americans have a biblical worldview. And again, fewer than 20% of Americans who describe themselves as evangelical, born-again Christians actually have a biblical worldview. And at the same time, other surveys have shown that
Hmm.
something like 60% of professing Christians in America hold at least one idea that is straight out of the New Age movement. In other words, the occult. So,
Yeah.
as the prophet Hosea said, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." We are living in those days.
It's certainly a foundation for what will be the harlot of Babylon, the coming apostasy. The very fact that there's, Amos 8:11 says that in that time there will be a famine in the land, but not a famine of bread and water, but a famine of the word of God. And it seems to be that there's teachers, there's people who will bring out and expound on the word of God and actually bring you a hermeneutical interpretation of what's said. We live in an age where knowledge is going to and fro, but there's so much of I guess we're in a generation as well where people don't want to hear it. They want to hear what they want to hear. Do you know, they want to get it to fit in with them. And I look at that, the Genesis 3, Genesis 6, Genesis 11, and straight away my thinking brings it to Machiavellianism, in the sense that I heard William Federer once say that Machiavellianism is like going around the back of the house, setting it on fire, then coming around the front and selling you a fire extinguisher. And it does seem to be like that. People, if you look at the fall, they take the alternative to the word of God. Then Genesis 6 comes in, and now they've got these false deities upon Mount Hermon, these small g gods that are basically become a point of worship for people, and then that builds up to this stronghold in Genesis 11. And I wonder if when you look at the I guess the ancient history of this, so many of the cultures all come out of a point of chaos. I know that you have the history around Marduk defeating Tiamat, the god of chaos, and I know that that's actually similar to Irish history. And you have the Olifish, the snake or serpent, the mother of demons, that actually in Irish legend St. Patrick goes against. But it's I guess when you look at that, do you think that there's the very fact that you see so much cohesion in, I guess, world mythological interpretation or legendary history, do you think that's just the same narrative? That's the same, obviously not coming off a biblical worldview, but it's like looking at the picture from a different direction.
It's what our former president Donald Trump would call fake news.
Yeah.
It's the same story, but just told from a different worldview. It's not a
Yeah.
coincidence that so many of the, and I was not aware of the chaos demon or chaos dragon
Right, face.
in
Yeah.
Irish mythology.
Yeah.
Celtic religion, other than a little bit of reading on Cernunnos and Herne the Hunter, which I included just in passing, really, in my book, The Second Coming of Saturn, because I believe that Kronos, Saturn, is the same entity. We see many parallels in ancient history. The scholars refer to this struggle against the chaos monster as the chaos Kampf. Marduk and Tiamat, but that's actually just a more modern or more recent version of the older story, where it was Enlil who defeated Tiamat, or Anu, the sky god, who defeated Tiamat. As different gods became ascendant with different cultures, the story was changed. In the Canaanite religion, it was all. I just say Baal just so scholars know that I know how to say it. But most of us know it as Baal. He defeated their version of the Chaos Dragon, who was called Yam, but was also referred to as Lotan, which is their version of Leviathan.
Right.
But
Okay.
the Greeks had Typhon. The Egyptians had Apophis. The Norse religion had Thor defeating Jormungandr. There was one in the
Yeah.
Hurrian religion called Ilionka, all defeated by a storm god or a warrior god of some sort. And the actual version, I think, is the true version of that story is what's contained in the Bible. The difference is that in all of these stories, and again, you can correct me on the Irish version of this since I'm not familiar, but the entity, the storm god, defeated this chaos dragon, chaos monster, only with great difficulty and sometimes with the assistance of another god. For example, when Zeus defeated Typhon, he needed help from the god Pan. When Ninurta defeated Bashmu, he needed a special weapon from Enlil. So, but in Genesis 1, verse 2, we see that the Spirit of God is hovering over the deep. The deep is Tehom, which is the Hebrew cognate for Tiamat.
Right.
So we suggest, when we look at that in Genesis 1, verse 2, we get an account of God, Yahweh, basically subduing chaos. Now, the ultimate destruction of chaos, the day of Yahweh, or the day of the Lord in the Old Testament. We see that in Isaiah chapter 27, where on that day, the Lord will defeat with his strong right arm. And I'm going to try to remember, try to look this up here so I don't have to try to remember it. I can hear our dog Grace outside the, so named because she's a rescue, and like her, all of us have been rescued or saved by love. So we call her Grace.
I have seen her on Facebook. I've seen the pictures of her.
A flat-coated retriever. They are the clowns of the dog world. So, in that day, which in the Old Testament, every time you see that phrase, in that day or on that day, it's a reference to the day of the Lord, which is when God finally says, I've had enough, I'm coming down there, and he puts a stop to it, brings judgment to an unrepentant world. In that day, the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. We suggest this is equivalent to Revelation 21, where there's a new heaven and a new earth, and the sea is no more. The sea in Scripture often represents chaos, the abyss, the bottomless pit. And again, chaos, Leviathan is the chaos dragon. What's interesting is that the fleeing serpent, the twisting serpent, that line Isaiah took directly from the Baal cycle and the description of Baal defeating Yam, the fleeing serpent, Yan, the twisting serpent, the encircler with 7 heads. And the idea of a 7-headed dragon ought to make people's ears pick up if they've read anything in the book of Revelation at all. You've got a couple of 7-headed entities in there. Satan, the 7-headed red dragon, but then the beast that emerges from the sea in Revelation 13, also described as a 7-headed entity. That 7-headed entity sounds like a weird chimera. Say, is it leopard, lion, beast? What is it? That's exactly how dragons in ancient Mesopotamia were described. And so, again, this is the kind of the foundation of why Sharon and I suspect that the spirit we call chaos or Leviathan is the spirit that indwells the human that we will call the Antichrist someday.
Oh, wow. That actually, well, that makes sense in the sense that, if the Leviathan is representative of chaos, we know that the Antichrist comes on the scene to bring a false construct of peace that won't be, that will be more controlled than anything else. Certainly controlled when it comes to Revelation 13 and the mark. But that, I never actually thought about that. That's, I guess it's fascinating, but you see all of this come together, and I know that in your book, The Second Coming of Saturn, that Saturn specifically relates to someone in Revelation. I don't know if you want to expound on that a little bit.
Sure. There are a number of key players in Revelation, and I think that even those American Christians who believe that Satan is a literal entity, and according to George Barna, again, his research finds that only about 40% of American Christians acknowledge Satan as a literal entity.
And that's Christians.
He obviously is one of the... Yeah, that's Christians, right, yeah. The other 60% think it's just a concept, a symbol that represents the evil in our own hearts. Satan obviously is the most powerful entity in the New Testament. And when Jesus was confronted by the scribes and Pharisees saying, oh, he's casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul, which means Baal the prince. And yes, Baal is a storm god, by the way.
Yeah.
That Jesus says, if Satan casts out demons by his own power, how will Satan's kingdom stand? Well, we learn two things there. First of all, Satan has a kingdom. Also, Satan is identified by Jesus there as the storm god. So Baal, Zeus, Jupiter, Thor, which is too bad because we love Thor in the movies, but Jesus identifies him as Satan. So clearly, he's the leader of this end times rebellion in the book of Revelation. Revelation 12 makes that clear. He's one of the key players. Obviously, the Antichrist, who we think is Leviathan, emerging from the sea, emerging from the bottomless pit, from the abyss, and again, the sea as a representation of chaos. We think the spirit of chaos, which you could argue there clearly is some influence from the spirit of chaos operating in the world today. He's one of the other key players. We identify in our book, Giants, Gods, and Dragons, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. We actually believe those are literal entities. And we identify the rider on the white horse as Apollo, the rider on the red horse, the war god Ares, Mars, Chemosh to the Moabites, the rider on the black horse, Mercury, Hermes, or in the ancient Akkadian and Babylonian pantheon, Nabu, god of scribes, the god of commerce, and as the god of scribes, he essentially would have been the one who was responsible for keeping tabs on tithes to the temples of the gods and so forth. Essentially, the god of lawyers and bankers, if you will.
Okay.
And if lawyers and bankers don't run the world today, I don't know who does. And then, of course, Death is the rider on the fourth horse with Hades following him like a fanboy, which is really interesting. So those we believe are actual entities. The woman who rides the beast in Revelation, we believe, is the ancient spirit called Inanna or Ishtar, or in the Bible, Astarte.
Yeah.
And the other, of course, is the one called the king, or the angel of the bottomless pit, the king over those who are in the bottomless pit. And that was one of the reasons I wrote the book, The Second Coming of Saturn, because we know from Greco-Roman mythology about this entity, Kronos, or Saturn, who was king of the Titans, formerly the chief god in existence, but when Zeus/Jupiter was born and secreted away because Kronos had eaten his other children, his parents Gaia and Uranus, Earth and Heaven, had told him that he would be overthrown by his children someday. So Kronos ate his children as they were born until the youngest, Zeus, came along. By this point, Rhea, the wife of Kronos, had finally detected a pattern. She was a little slow to catch on. See, he ate the first 6. Maybe I should do something to save this one. So Zeus was raised in secret. He led a rebellion and overthrew Kronos and the Titans. They're banished to the bottomless pit, to Tartarus. Well, in 2 Peter 2, verse 4, very interesting, we read Peter writing, God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into, now our English language Bibles read hell, but the word in Greek is Tartarosis. He cast them into Tartarus, not Hades. It's the only place in the Bible where that word is used. And as Dr. Heiser used to say, if it's in the Bible and it's weird, it's probably important.
Yeah.
So, okay, so these are the angels who sinned, and in 2 Peter 2, also Jude 6 and 7, a reference to those angels who were in chains in gloomy darkness until the final judgment. Who would they be? Well, they'd be the angels from the sons of God from Genesis chapter 6, because in the context, Peter and Jude make it clear that the sin for which these angels were punished was a sexual sin. And the only place in Scripture where you see anything like that is Genesis 6, where they saw that the daughters of man were fair, etc. Okay. Well, that seems to sort of track with what happened to the Titans. They were overthrown and cast down into Tartarus and locked up there forever. So I began researching this because it struck me as odd that we could kind of identify some of the other entities at work. There are references to, say, Zeus and Hermes in the New Testament. In fact, it was thought by the people on the island of Crete, I believe it was, where Paul and Barnabas were Zeus and Hermes. But Jesus, in Revelation chapter 2, in the letter to Pergamum, said, I know where you live, where Satan dwells, is a reference to the great altar of Zeus. So again, you've got these references there where you begin to see that the apostles and the early church understood that the gods of the Greeks and Romans and the Egyptians and the Canaanites, Phoenicians, so on, were real entities, just fallen angels. So as I began tracking this, I came to the conclusion that this entity, Kronos, Saturn, called Baal Haman to the Phoenicians, and we know from other ancient texts, scribes in the ancient world used to compile god lists, sort of like the ancient clay tablet version of Google Translate, where they would put lists of names in Akkadian and then in Canaanite and then in Egyptian or what have you, so that you could identify, okay, who was this entity to the Akkadians? Okay, he's Enlil there. To the Canaanites, he's El. And to the Phoenicians, he's Baal Haman. We know from Greek and Roman writers that's the same as Saturn and Kronos. And then, so you can start piecing the puzzle together. You basically come down to this. The entity called El by the Canaanites, or Enlil by the Babylonians, was Dagon to the Phoenicians, or to the Philistines rather, the Philistines and the Amorites. The Hebrews called him Molech, later called Saturn and Kronos by the Romans and Greeks. He was also known to the Hittites and the Hurrians, who lived in what is now Turkey and Armenia and northern Mesopotamia, as Kumarbi. And I think he is the same entity who led the rebellion in Genesis chapter 6. Shemiyaza, leader of the Watchers, or chief of the Watchers, according to 1 Enoch. And he comes out of the, because he would be the leader of this group that is now in the abyss, in Tartarus, in the bottomless pit. He would be the equivalent of Abaddon or Apollyon, who comes out of the pit in Revelation chapter 9. So I think the evidence fits together when you put all those pieces together and start looking at how the puzzle, the picture develops. I think Shemiyaza, who led this rebellion back in Genesis 6, was punished, according to Peter and Jude, by being sent to Tartarus, is the one who comes out of Tartarus, the bottomless pit, in Revelation chapter 9. And I think this is something to ponder. We know that Satan is still wandering the earth. He was described, at least in terms of the time of Job, as having access to the throne room of God, because he was up there with the sons of God. When you look at Satan in the Old Testament, you see that nowhere in the Old Testament is he connected to the underworld or connected to the Rephaim, the Nephilim, the giants, the demons. He's still wandering the earth, and yet this entity who led that rebellion in Genesis chapter 6 and his colleagues, God found it necessary to chain them up in the bottomless pit, and they're not getting out until Revelation 9 when they're loosed on an unrepentant world. Does this suggest that this entity, Shemiyaza, Molech, Apollyon, is more dangerous than Satan? It's possible. Otherwise, why is he not still wandering around?
Well, there's definitely a connection when you look at Revelation chapter 9, and Abaddon or Apollyon is given the ability to torment through the demon horde that comes out, torment mankind, but mankind isn't able to die for a specific amount of time. And that would, I've heard you talk about this before, that would relate back, 5 months would relate back to the flood. And sorry, carry on. You can explain it better than me.
It was a little bit surprising because we talked about the number 70 and how symbolic it is, and we see other numbers that are clearly symbolic in throughout Scripture: 3 and 7 and 10 and 40. Hundreds, thousands. The number 70, of course, meaning the complete set, all of them, not one left out. But why 5 months? Why does Apollyon and his horde get just 5 months to torment humanity at the end? But when you go back and look at Genesis 7, right at the end of Genesis 7, I believe, it's the end of 7 and the beginning of Genesis 8, or is it 8 and 9? I've got to go back and look now to make sure I'm not... Yes, I was right. End of Genesis 7, beginning of Genesis 8, we see twice that the number of days that the Ark of Noah was on the water before the waters receded was 150 days. And again, that's kind of an odd number until you realize in a lunar calendar of 30-day months, that's exactly 5 months. So you get this period of 150 days while these entities, the Watchers, have been removed from the scene, confined to Tartarus, and they're watching their monstrous, gigantic children, the Nephilim, destroyed in the flood of Noah. At the end, they get 5 months to torment the unrepentant remnant left on earth. After we
Hmm.
believe the churches were moved out of here, but anyway, the unrepentant population of the earth for 5 months. I think it bookends. It's not coincidental. So, yeah, I think that's the another bit of evidence that suggests that the entities in the abyss are the same ones who were put there back in the time of Noah.
I remember teaching this before, that talking about people's fascination with the demonic and so on. You have people like Anton LaVey, you have people like Aleister Crowley, and in 1907, I think it's 1907, Aleister Crowley said he had an experience. It was kind of a seance, and he, in this seance, battled a demon. He gave this demon a different name, but he called it the demon of the abyss, the angel of the abyss, which, you're reading Revelation 9 and you think, it's right there. But in his terminology, he believed that he defeated this demon, overcame this demon, and then created the false religion Thelema. And it gets me thinking, are we living in an age in which, I guess, I to coincide with what you're saying with the second coming of Saturn, in which there is this destructive kind of force coming to the surface, like bubbling to the surface. I know that there was on the 21st of December, I think it was 2020, there was what was known as, in some circles, as the Great Conjunction. Can you share, does that have relevance to the second coming of Saturn?
Well, yeah, I think it does from an occult perspective. And, of course, as Christians, we understand that our
Yeah.
futures, our destinies have nothing whatsoever to do with the movement of planets in the sky, but some very
Yes.
powerful, very wealthy people do believe that. Most prominently here for Americans, we remember that Ronald Reagan's calendar. I mean, he's, for a conservative, politically conservative Americans, Ronald Reagan is one of the greatest presidents in our history, and yet his calendar was set by his wife Nancy on the advice of her astrologer Jean Dixon. So there are people, very wealthy,
Yeah.
powerful people, who believe that the movement of the planets in the sky does affect our destiny. And even Reagan, who is by most Christians accepted as a Christian president, well, yeah, okay, but he was still letting his wife dictate his calendar based on what her astrologer told her. So on December 21st, the winter solstice of 2020, we had the great, the great conjunction. There were others who called it the Christmas star, which is really a misnomer
Yeah.
because that's not what, the meeting of Jupiter and Saturn in the night sky is not what the three wise men saw.
Yeah.
The astrologers refer to it as the great mutation, where they believe this is the representation of a transfer of power in the heavenlies, where Jupiter, representing Zeus, Baal, Satan, the king of the pantheon, was sort of handing the baton back to Saturn. Old dad is coming out now, and now it's his time to reign again. This conjunction took place at 0 degrees of the constellation Aquarius. So, 50 years after that famous, song by the Fifth Dimension, we are now finally fully into the age of Aquarius, which is supposed to represent a new era of prosperity and so on and so on. Again, as your viewers are probably thinking, well, this is a bunch of silliness. Yeah, but just remember, astrology is about a $2 billion a year industry. A lot of people spend a lot of money on this to try to figure out what's coming in their future. I think it's not a coincidence that 30 days after this great mutation or great conjunction, the World Economic Forum unveiled officially its Great Reset Initiative, January 20th of 2021. I think they see this as the start of a new age and the time to initiate and fundamentally reconstruct human civilization. And certainly this past couple of years, we've seen a lot of things going on that just seemed unthinkable years ago. I mean, the idea that we should just, by 2030, according to the World Economic Forum, that we will own nothing and we'll be happy. We should give up eating animal protein in favor of eating insects and mealworms and so forth. It's like, um, what are they thinking? Well, they
But
think that their time has
yeah,
come due to this change in the sky, signaling the beginning, the literal dawning of a new age.
it does seem that no matter what objections come out in regards to the WEF's agenda or what they're proposing as they're basically a think tank on steroids. That's what I've always referred to them as. But when you look at C40 cities, 15-minute cities, you would think who would sign up to that? And yet we know certain states in America have signed up to it. We know there's places in the UK have signed up to it. And if you actually read the fine print of, we will reduce to, I think it was 60 grams of meat per person per consumption with the ideal of getting to zero. So, which is straight out of First Timothy, that you'll abstain from meats. I remember reading that thinking, oh, that'll never ever happen. And then you live in these days and you start to think, well, even if this is just like, I hold no stock in astrology or anything like that, and it's wicked, it's off the enemy, but you can see them. The way I'm trying to say it is the devil is not hiding anymore. The playbook is out there and it's published, and it's the gathering of people together, and you start to see this is the strategy. You'll own nothing, you'll be happy. C40 cities, you'll be restricted into a certain area. You won't be able to drive, no private ownership, no car ownership. 3 items of clothing per person per year that you can buy. You would think who would ever sign up to it, but yet this is still being ushered in, and that makes me look at the timing of what would be the great manipulation or the great conjunction, and think, well, maybe there is a demonic agenda at play. And earlier you had said that you didn't like the term portals, but as in, want to use it because it's kind of a charged term. But I often think, I'd said to you that your friend LA has asked me to be a producer on this film over here, and it's specifically around monoliths, and it's specifically around Irish monoliths, and over here. So whenever I talked about something close to our church called the Giant's Ring, which is a mound, and in the center is a small construct of large rocks, and it's a monolith. But in Irish history, it's seen as a she. It's a place in which the Tuath de Danann, which would have been initially the Tuath De, the tribe or the god tribe, that's what they were initially called. When they died, they would be buried there, and then that would be a burial place. And I just want to share this with you quickly. I was talking with my mom the other day because she brought up a story about an area facing her that was marked by a tree, but the Tuath de Danann, which can be, like a lot of people, it was even connected through medieval literature to the fallen angels, the Watchers. Um, but then they became known as the fairies. But this fairy tree, this marker, 3 men decided to chop it down, and there was a big, uproar. Don't chop it down! Don't chop it down! And the 3 men died. I'm just telling you a little bit about here. There was a protest down south, I think at the end of the 90s, because there was a motorway being made, and it was going over a Tuath de Danann, or a burial site, and it had to be diverted. And I guess what I'm saying, in marked with what you've just said about the Great Conjunction, and the Matthew 24:37, that we know the days of the Son of Man, the coming of the Son of Man, will be like the days of Noah. Do you think that there's some sort of, re-emergence of these the re-emergence of the Genesis 6 spiritual aspect to it, like a fight to be worshipped, if you get what I'm saying, as in like these fallen
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
yeah. I think when we discuss portals, In fact, I'm going to have this discussion next month on my podcast with my roundtable participants, Dr. Judd Burton, Brian Godawa, and Pastor Doug Van Dorn. I think the portal that we need to be most concerned about is the one that's, like right here, the human heart. When you give these entities permission to come into you, they will take it. I don't think there are geographic portals. I don't believe in ley lines or things of that nature. But there are, as with idols in the ancient world, where idols were not the objects of worship themselves, they just gave locality to the deity being worshipped. So that little statue that you were praying to, you weren't actually praying to the statue. The statue was there as sort of a supernatural radio receiver to give the entity a place to rest while you prayed to it or whatever. I think the same holds true with some of these megalithic sites. And we visited, as I know L.A. Marzulli has, a number of megalithic sites in Israel, Gilgal Rephaim for one. But this past March, we were blessed by the opportunity to spend a day there, and at another site just north of there, a serpent-shaped ridge that makes the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio look like an earthworm. It's 200 feet wide. It's 3/4 of a mile in length and 20 to 25 feet high, covered with about 140 megalithic burial monuments, dolmens and cairns. And the archaeologist who's done the most recent excavation there and at Gilgal Rephaim spent a day with us there. And so we're in the process of working on a video to share what we learned from Dr. Mike Freakman at those locations. And then a similar site overlooking the Jordan River about 2 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. But there are a number of sites all over the lands of the Bible, these dolmens. There are more dolmens, and I know that's a Celtic word actually that means table, because the simplest form of these is sort of a simple trilithon shape. You got two vertical standing stones with a tabletop stone across the top. There are about 25,000 of them in Israel and Jordan between Mount Hermon and the Dead Sea. That speaks to the supernatural fight that was taking place between God and then Jesus specifically in the first century and the fallen realm. We know from some Canaanite myths from the ancient kingdom of Ugarit, which was destroyed in the middle of the period of the Judges around 1200 BC, that the area north of the Sea of Galilee and the Sea of Galilee itself were considered supernaturally charged. It was believed to be a place where the underworld gods, in other words, the Rephaim, were located and buried. Jesus specifically located his ministry in that region. His hometown of Nazareth, he relocated from there to Capernaum, which is on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, which is curious when you stop to think about it. Why would he go there if the center of the religious hierarchy in Judea in the first century was in Jerusalem? He was about as far away from Jerusalem as you could get in Judea on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. But when you understand, and as a student of history, Gary, I know you appreciate this, when you understand the historical context of what was going on in that period, in that area, rather, going back thousands of years before the time of Jesus, his location there, his choice to be baptized there, north of the Sea of Galilee, not down near Jericho where people think, his declaration of divinity at the foot of Mount Hermon, Caesarea Philippi, and then the transfiguration on Mount Hermon. It makes all the sense in the world. Now, why did he do that? He could have just said, look, portals aren't really a thing. They don't exist. We don't believe in them. I think that, when we are at the marriage supper of the Lamb and he starts explaining theology to us and the way the spirit realm really works, we're all going to be a little bit surprised. But what he did was he worked with what people understood to be true, what they thought was true, what they believed to be true. And so he went there and said, okay, I know I'm in an area now, ancient Bashan, where there are more dolmens than anywhere else on planet Earth. It's like 5,600 dolmens have been discovered so far in the area north and east of the Sea of Galilee, the ancient kingdom of Og of Bashan. In fact, Israeli archaeologist Moshe Hartal, who led the survey of the Golan Heights, said in 2014, we can no longer use the term dolmen field because we can't tell where one ends and the next one begins. for all intents and purposes, the ancient kingdom of Og of Bashan was one giant dolmen field. Combine
Yeah.
that with the Ugaritic myths, the Canaanite religion, and their understanding that somewhere in that vicinity of the Sea of Galilee was this massive location, literally the entrance to the netherworld. Essentially, ancient Bashan was the entrance to the Canaanite hell. And so
Yeah.
Jesus went there, this place that for thousands of years everybody knew was the entrance to the netherworld, and that's where he declared war on the dead, if you will, the spirits of the giants destroyed in the flood, demons. A big part of his ministry, casting out demons, but he based his ministry there, north of the Sea of Galilee, in an area that everyone who'd lived in that area, that region for thousands of years knew was supernaturally supercharged. And then, of course, he went to Mount Hermon, which one scholar has called the Canaanite Olympus. Okay, this is where the gods met, and that was where he was transfigured. I mean, can you send a clearer signal, not just to your human followers, but into the spirit realm? Now, whether that Mount Hermon was a literal portal or not, Jesus sent a very clear message to these pagan gods, the fallen angels, and to their followers. And
What if the
it's just astonishing when you begin to understand the historic and religious context of what Jesus did.
well, even you hear the Father speak and say, "This is my Son, hear him," and which I would take that as ignore all of the other voices, ignore all of the other distractions.
Right.
Whenever you talk about mountains, they seem to feature heavily when it comes to the likes of the Genesis 6 narrative and idolatry. Like I know over here, there was a Greek individual who moved over and called Mount Ergil, Mount Olympus. He saw that's in Donegal over here. He saw that as a place of worship. Then you've got Mount Olympus. You've got Mount Hermon. Is there something significant? I know if it goes back to Ezekiel 28 that you see that God walks on the mountain, but is there something significant that why it seems to be mountain focused, if that makes sense?
Well, that's a good question. In fact, that was the inspiration for my book, The Great Inception, was when I realized how many supernaturally charged things seem to happen around mountains. Of course, Eden, Ezekiel 28, was a mountain. Babel was an artificial mountain. The fact that this step pyramid or ziggurat was shaped like a mountain was not coincidental. That's where the gods lived. Everybody in the ancient world knew gods lived on mountains because they're pristine, unsullied by human hands. They're remote, and so, of course, gods being gods, they get all the best stuff. So they live in the mountains, which is Mount Hermon was considered sacred even in ancient Babylon, which was a 4-month walk back in the day. There were taller. What's really strange about that, Gary, is that there are taller mountains over in what is now Iran. So ancient Elam or Persia, there were much taller. Mount Hermon on the list of tall mountains on planet Earth is not even in the top 100. So why that mountain?
Right.
I don't know. But something about mountains in particular. Of course, we got the Mount Hermon incident. Baal, his palace was located on a mountain called Mount Safan, today called Jebel al-Aqra. It's near the city of Antakya, ancient Antioch. You've got the mountain where Muhammad got his revelation, Jebel al-Nur. We'll call it an alleged revelation. But this was a common theme, and I think it's because in the ancient world people understood that there was some memory that Eden was on a mountain, as you say, Ezekiel 28, the mountain of God, but also this belief that mountains were distant, remote, and that must be where the gods live because it's far away from us, and look how pretty they are. So, but again, Jesus could have denied all that and said, look, none of that is true. What matters is what you believe. But he didn't. He went to the base of Mount Hermon and said, who do people say the Son of Man is? And who do you say that I am? And then 6 days later, he climbed Mount Hermon and declared his divinity there. What I think is interesting is when you compare the mountain that God has decreed for himself, Zion, and compare it to Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is 9,200 and some odd feet. You can only get there starting in late August and early September when the snow begins to melt away. At least you can't get up there now because the United Nations has an observation post up there. You're not allowed up there anymore. But
is that something prophetic? I'm just asking.
Well, I think the UN may not even realize why it's up there. But yes, this representation of the one world government is on the summit of Mount Hermon with the highest man-made place of worship on earth. To this day, the highest man-made place of worship, the highest man-made temple on earth is on Mount Hermon. So, yeah, they're up there. You can't get there. It's hard to get to. Back in the day, it was a real trek. And yet, somehow, the Romans built a temple up there. Somebody engraved on a slab a memento or a stone commemorating the Watchers' rebellion there in archaic Greek. By order of the Most High and Holy God, those who swore an oath proceed from here. That was found in 1869 by Sir Charles Warren and brought back to... it's in the British Museum, but it's not on display, interestingly. Anyway, but the mountain that God chose for himself, Zion, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, is not even the tallest hill in Jerusalem. You can look down on it from the western hill where David's palace was located, from the Mount of Olives across the Kidron Valley. The Mount of Olives is about 200 feet higher. In fact, I argue in the Second Coming of Saturn that one of the reasons Solomon was compelled to build a high place for Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites, otherwise known as Molech, is because this is the same entity called Shemiyaza back in the time of Noah and Abaddon, Apollyon. He built a temple for Milcom, Solomon did, on this hill that is on the east of the Temple Mount. So when they opened the doors of the temple to God, you would look up and you would see the high place for Milcom, Molech, on the Mount of Olives.
Looking down.
Yeah. It's astonishing.
Yeah.
But then when you look at the last week of Jesus' life, so much of what he did in that final week was on the Mount of Olives. In fact, the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 and following, where he basically laid out for his followers what was going to happen in the end times. He did it on that same mountain. He was arrested there, crucified there, buried there, resurrected from there. According to Luke, he ascended into heaven from the Mount of Olives. And of course, in Zechariah 14:4, when he returns, he lands on the Mount of Olives and it splits in half. And I suggest that this is not coincidental. And by the way, asking just to address a question in the chat, the Battle of Armageddon will not be fought in the north. It will be fought at Jerusalem because it is all about this mountain. In Hebrew, the phrase is Mount of Assembly. And that is Har Moed in Hebrew. Har Moed, Mount of Assembly. We see that phrase in Isaiah chapter 14, which is that famous verse in the King James Version. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? Or in the ESV, how you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. Verse 13, I will sit on the Mount of Assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will sit on the Har Moed in the Yarakate Tsephon. We'll set aside the Yarakate Tsephon. That also relates to Ezekiel 38 and 39, but your sharp-eared viewers, listeners would recognize that word Tsephon. That's the name of Baal's mountain in Turkey, Satan's mountain. Anyway, but the Har Moed, the Mount of Assembly, this relates back to Ezekiel 28. This is where God meets. For pagans, it's where the gods meet, sort of a Mount Olympus type of setting. This rebel in Isaiah 14, and I argued that it's Shemiyaza, a.k.a. Molech, not Satan, but regardless, the idea was that he was going to establish his own Har Moed, his own Mount of Assembly. Now, when John, writing the book of Revelation in Greek, had to come up with the phrase to describe where this final battle would be fought, he transliterated, and this is based on research by a scholar named Charles Torrey, T-O-R-R-E-Y, in the 1930s, the Harvard Theological Review. So this is not, some guy on the internet. This is very serious. Scholar pointed out that this phrase, Clearly important in Isaiah chapter 14, wants to establish his ruling mountain, his own personal Olympus in the far reaches of the north, perhaps Mount Zephon, the mountain of Baal.
Hmm.
Har Moed, in that word Moed, which is assembly or congregation, has a character in the middle of it in Hebrew that looks like a reverse apostrophe. The sound it makes is just a glottal stop, Moed. It does not have a corresponding sound or letter in Greek or in Hebrew. So John,
Okay.
writing in Greek, had to try to find a way to transliterate it into Greek without a corresponding letter. So he chose the Greek character gamma.
Right.
So, Har Magedon. English speakers trying to transliterate or translate from Greek back into English assumed, that means Megiddo,
Hmm.
assuming that the gamma must correspond to the Hebrew character gimel, which does have that g sound instead of just the glottal stop. Torrey, 90 years ago, pointed out, no, this is a war for the Mount of Assembly. Har Moed, that's Zion. And that explains why Jesus would be landing on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem rather than at Megiddo, which is like 50 miles away. If the battle's being fought there, that makes no sense. No, this is all being fought for Jerusalem, and that's consistent with the apocalyptic prophecies elsewhere in the Old Testament, elsewhere in Zechariah and in Amos and Joel. So the battle of Armageddon will be fought at Jerusalem, which is why there's so much tension and violence over the Temple Mount to this day.
Yeah. I had Mondo Gonzalez on before. I actually got to meet Mondo when he was over here, and we were.
Love Mondo, great man.
He's brilliant. We were talking about the red heifer prophecy and everything that's sort of culminating right now. And obviously, there's the focus on Israel right now. There's the things that are happening. What would be? I think I know what you're going to say, but what would be the focal point, prophetic wise, right now for you? What's the thing that puts the hairs on the back of your neck up, the spidey sense going, we're near the time of the rapture. What is it that's kind of got your interest?
Well, we're a little different. Sharon and I have been producing now since 2019 a program called Unraveling Revelation, and we release a new episode every week. We, in the book, as I mentioned, Giants, Gods, and Dragons, we identify what we think are the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And we believe that they've been riding, that those first five seals, actually, of Revelation chapter 6 have been opened since the first century.
Okay.
Now, we are still pre-tribulation believers, so
Yeah.
we see the opening of the sixth seal as the next event. That's the great earthquake, and we believe that corresponds to the rapture of the church.
Okay.
This is drawn from research done by a friend of ours, David W. Lowe, who wrote a book called Earthquake Resurrection more than 15 years ago, and really got us to rethink our theology. We sort of took it as given that as a pre-tribulation, with a pre-tribulation rapture, the seals have not yet been opened. But we read in Revelation 4:5 that no one was found worthy in heaven, on earth, or under the earth to open those seals. It's like, now wait a minute. We know from the New Testament that, in fact, Stephen was an eyewitness, saw Jesus at the right hand of the Father. But we see elsewhere in the epistles that Jesus is mentioned as being at the right hand of the Father. It's in Hebrews, it's in Ephesians, it's in Galatians. So if Jesus is at the right hand of the Father, and he is the one who opens those seals in Revelation 6, then how is it possible that that's still a future event, that for 2,000 years nobody has known where is the Messiah, the one who is worthy to open the seals? It's like, no, if he was at the right hand of the Father in the first century, by the time of Stephen, in fact, in Acts chapter 2, on Pentecost, Peter says he's at the right hand of the Father. So by the year 30 A.D., Jesus was already at the right hand of the Father, just as in
You're
Revelation 12.
My theology right now. I'm kind of going. I've never actually thought of that.
We hadn't either until we read Earthquake Resurrection. Highly recommend the book. David W. Lowe, Lowe, Earthquake Resurrection. He's an accountant by trade, so he's very precise in dotting his I's and crossing his T's. But that blew us away. It's like, well, okay, that kind of makes sense, because Yeah, if Peter said in 30 A.D., he's
Yeah.
at the right hand of the Father. We know in Revelation chapter 12, where John is describing the woman clothed in the sun with the moon at her feet, and she gives birth to a male child who will rule the world with a rod of iron. Okay, he's seeing into the past because that's clearly a reference to Jesus.
Hmm.
So we know that there's at least one other place in Revelation where he looks back into the past.
Yeah.
So we suggest the same is holding true when he's looking back at, who can open the seals. Nobody is found worthy in heaven, on earth, under the earth. And suddenly the Lamb appears between the four living creatures, the cherubim or cherubim, and the throne. And he takes the scroll and begins opening the seals. So these four horsemen, well, four and a half, because Hades is riding in a sidecar with
Yeah.
with Thanatos, death. They've been riding since the first century, but we're still waiting, and we would suggest that the fifth seal, which is the souls under the altar, saying, "How long, O Lord?" These are those who were martyred for their faith in God. That you could apply to the prophets of old, who were the prophets of
Hmm.
Yahweh, who were martyred for their faith. We're waiting for the sixth seal, the next big event. Now, how close are we to that? It's impossible to know, but
Yeah.
with the Israel-Hamas war going on right now, the prospect that might escalate into a wider regional conflict gets
Hmm.
us thinking. Okay, maybe for example, Bill Salas, author of
Yeah.
the Psalm 83 War, maybe he's right.
Hmm.
Would that result in a wider conflict? It could very well. It could very well. We don't set dates, but boy, things are moving so quickly, especially since 2012. We look back over the last 10, 11 years and just see the way our society has changed. What is considered acceptable and what is considered inappropriate now,
Yeah.
where university professors can't say that only men, that men can't have babies to get fired. It's like, what? I
It's
mean, even 10
crazy.
years ago, that would have been considered crazy.
Yeah.
Now that's considered the norm in academia. Things are changing so quickly that I think we are approaching the culmination, the end of the age, as Jesus called it, and that final 7-year period of history before the day of the Lord and Armageddon.
I am still caught up on Revelation 6 there, and my head is spinning a little bit because I always equated it. I looked at Zechariah 6 and would read that and think, well, you see that although they're positioned as chariots there, but you see the colors come through, and I always sort of said, well, the way I likened it in my head is they running to and fro. So there's kind of like a horse before it gets let out of the stalls when it's racing, like it's jockeying. So you see, lack will be growing in different places of the world, war and the red horse, and all of that, and then eventually the seals would be open and it would just go. But I had never once considered the statement of, well, I considered the statement of there's none worthy to open it, but I never considered it on the context of location. And sorry, yeah, we got something else to teach on Sunday. I thought I went deep. Do you know, I had complaints that I go too slow with our Bible study, that it took us near almost 2 years to get through the book of Revelation. And you've been going since 2016 with the book of Revelation.
Yeah. Well, 2019, but still, we're
Really?
4 years in, and we're
Yeah.
only up to Revelation 19. So
Oh. Guys, we are going. I've had quite a lot of Derek's time, so if you've got a quick question, excuse me, if you could throw it up really, really quickly, because I don't want to take up his time. It is the holiday Christmas season, and I want to allow him to have time with his wife. Um, May the sixth trumpet war. I can't read that without my glasses. Sorry, can you
Sixth
read
Trumpet
that?
War is the next event.
That
Well,
was,
let me. Yeah, I don't think we're at we're not at the trumpet judgments yet.
yeah.
I think we're still dealing with the seals, and since the sixth seal would be the next event, the trumpets don't begin to blow until the seventh seal is opened. So I think we still have a ways to go. Again, I don't think we'll be here when the trumpets are. But if we are, well,
Well, this is the thing. I think the church is very split. Like, as in, it becomes such a point of contention: pre, mid, post. I'm pre-tribulation rapture, and I don't care if somebody's mid-trib, post-trib. It just means
Right,
that, you
right.
know what, I'll keep a seat for you at the marriage supper. That's all. Someone's asked, can I ask, what is your take on crop circles? I think that came up with L.A. Marzulli
Yeah.
as well. Um,
Well, this isn't something we studied a lot, but interestingly, Sharon wrote that into one of her novels years ago. We had started writing a fictional series that we're finally coming back to now in 2024, where we were writing independently of each other, but we were sharing characters and plot points back and forth.
mhm.
And the publisher got real nervous after they published her first two novels called Winds of Evil and The Armageddon Strain, because she had crop circles and demons and experiments, genetic experiments taking place at a place called the Mount Hermon Institute. Um,
Okay.
and when they were working on my first novel, The God Conspiracy, which we finally published and really gave a push in 2020 because it suddenly became a lot more relevant. It dealt with a mysterious, experimental serum that was being forced on people. And this was originally written back in 2005. So uh, uh, the publisher got really nervous. It's like, you got crop circles and UFOs in your story. What does it have to do with the Bible? Like,
Mhm.
what in this life does not have anything to do with the Bible? I mean, if we're Christians, we should be able to explain anything.
Yeah.
I think a lot of crop circles are hoaxes, but I think those that are not are probably there as a deception to draw people into the sci-fi religion of the ancient aliens, belief that somehow our space brothers will help us ascend or evolve. So I think it is a demonic deception.
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to ask you, because Ellie and I had sort of said that, I believe the same, that this is the deception that might gather everybody's attention somewhere else, and it's a deception that will try and explain away a rapture. It's interesting now that I know LA's been doing that for years, studying all of that side of
Mm-hmm.
things, but that
But
it's
back in
mainstream now.
2017, well,
Yeah.
it is. And what's interesting is that in 2017, Defender Publishing, who's published all of our nonfiction work, put out a book that I co-wrote with my friend Josh Peck called The Day the Earth Stands Still, which is a play on
Hmm.
that movie title, The Day the Earth Stood Still.
Yeah.
It was released literally 1 week before the New York Times published that bombshell article on the Tic Tac UFO spotted by the Navy pilots, the F-18 pilots from the USS Nimitz. I mean, we couldn't
Hmm.
have asked for better marketing, but because we weren't taking the line that, oh, yes, we're being visited by our space brothers, the book got pretty much ignored. But not to pat ourselves on the back, but I
Hmm.
thought, did some pretty good investigative digging and found a direct linear connection, point by point, link by link, connecting the occult theology of Helena Blavatsky and Aleister Crowley to Eric von Daniken
Hmm.
and to Zechariah Sitchin and Ancient Aliens.
Wow.
And it, weirdly enough, it goes through the horror fiction author H.P. Lovecraft. But you can see
Yeah.
point by point how Lovecraft and essentially, if he was not hearing from the same spirit that was talking to Aleister Crowley, then there's just a massive coincidence. And I will say for the record, I am not a coincidence theorist. So,
No.
in fact, Crowley's personal secretary, Kenneth Grant, believed that Crowley and Lovecraft were hearing from the same spirits. And that was the stuff that Zechariah Sitchin and Eric von Daniken have repackaged into what has become sort of the gospel of ET today.
Yeah. It's even when you look at Thelema, I know Thelema literally means will, but that's the number one precept of his religion: do what thou wilt, do it
Right,
rather
right.
than do what God wills. But the entity that he talked about was Lam, this alien headed. Look, when I say alien headed, if you take a picture of what is seen culturally as an alien, and you take this picture of Lam that he drew, it's the same. It's
Looks like
hard.
a stereotypical gray alien. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that you know this is the way my head sort of thinks. Like I said earlier with Machiavellianism, the idea that you replace the truth with an alternative. And I said this to LA on Friday. 24th of November 1859, Darwin releases his Origin of Species. In 1883, his cousin coins the phrase eugenics, Sir Francis Galton, and you kind of think to yourself, well, is this not kind of just reading off the demonic strategy that you saw at the beginning? Take away the truth of how creation started, take away the author of our life, and then say, let us make ourselves in our own image. And then that's us primed for what you see now as, like you say, the gospel of the UFO, or do you know what I mean? And we're living in an age now where I never actually thought, like I remember years ago watching X-Files and thinking it was entertainment, but I never thought it would become this mainstream, government revealed, mainstream media covered subject. These are, the only way I can say it, these are prophetic times that we're living in.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Listen, Derek, I am really, really thankful. I know we had the hiccups with the technology at the start, but praise God, the enemy was rebuked and we got through with it. And
Amen.
This was fantastic. It is not often I finish a stream where my theology has been challenged. I'm still thinking about that right now. So, guys, if you could, sorry, I put my glasses away and then I can't see. Is it a possibility that they will try and introduce one of these aliens as the Messiah, Antichrist, come to save the world? I don't know if you've got time for that. I know it's...
well, it's entirely possible. I think that my personal theory is that it's more likely to be somebody who represents himself to the world as a Jew. And that's mainly because, and I don't say that to, we love Israel. We will visit Israel next November again. We had planned to go in March. Obviously, with the war, that's not really possible. But, we understand that Jesus, there is no special dispensation for any group of people in this world. Mm-hmm. And yet, Scripture shows that God still has a role for Israel and for the Jews to play in the end times. Yeah. I think the enemy, and the reason this war is going to focus on Israel, is because the enemy has such an inhuman hatred of what God has chosen for himself, the land of Israel and the people. We can argue about the geopolitical state of Israel. Yes, it's run by fallen, sinful men and women, just as every other nation on earth is. I get that. I understand that. But I think what will happen is that to deceive the Jews and the religious Jews, especially the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, who are looking for, who have an eschatological system that they believe in, I think they will welcome a geopolitical savior, just as they were looking for one in the first century, which is why they missed Jesus at the first coming. They will look for another geopolitical savior and welcome him as their Moshiach. I think, however, and this is where I take some comfort and hope in this, in Zechariah 12, where it prophesies that they will look on him whom they have pierced and mourn. I think a day is coming where they will recognize him for who he is and come back to the faith. So that's kind of how I see things. Certainly, I think the UFO deception has a role to play in drawing people away, but I think the whole focus of this is the Har Moed, Armageddon, Jerusalem, Mount Zion, the Temple Mount. That's what this struggle is all about, because God declared it for his. The enemy wants to take it for theirs. Why? I don't fully understand it. I don't fully understand the need for that mountain, but that's where the evidence in Scripture points, and so that is what I think the final battle will be about and what will prompt it.
Well, I agree with you on all of that. I'm not. That didn't change any of my theological thinking there. Guys, can you just join me in wishing Derek and Sharon just a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year? I'm going to end the broadcast and thank you. I'll thank you personally off air. But guys, if you just take a second, just say if you got something from tonight, hit one. If you, I know you did. I know this was deep tonight. So if you got something, hit one. If you can do me the favor, you know that both our Facebook and our YouTube have been we've been experiencing shadow banning. So if you can share it out there, that would be fantastic. That would be really appreciated. Guys, God bless. And again, Derek, thank you so much.
It's been an honor, Gary. I really enjoyed it. And